Look, I mean, if you really wanted to get a temporary dopamine boost to determine what exactly that feels like, to see if you have a deficiency in dopaminergic signaling, or to just get motivation to do work, then 9-MeBC actually will suffice in an acute manner for that. This is a not very well studied research chemical that has some research on it behind the ability to alleviate some of the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, and it's got a lot of broken down mechanisms for it, not the least of which are monoamine oxidase inhibition, but at the same time, like regeneration of some of the genetic factors that allow you to project and create dopamine in various regions of your brain, not just like the dopamine origination points like ventral tegmental area, but other areas too. Upregulation of the conversion enzymes that take your tyrosine and turn it into L-DOPA, and then L-DOPA into usable dopamine. It's got neurologically anti-inflammatory effects. It's got the ability to reduce actual neurotoxic agent induced neurotoxicity. And though it should generally be taken as a cycle over a long period of time, say 30 to 40 days, to try to regenerate any degree of dopaminergic function that you think may be awry, it also is pretty useful for acute periods, for diagnosing dopamine issues and just to kind of see what that dopaminergic effect feels like. Like if you start taking it and suddenly your anhedonia goes away, or you're more motivated to do stuff, or you're energized, or your libido starts coming back, well, then you have a dopaminergic issue, and this is why 9-MeBC may be a useful tool. And that's what we're going to talk about, boys. We talk about 9-MeBC among other dopamine hacking protocols. Perfect timing as usual. In the Supercharged Dopamine Speed course, that thing is 20% off right now. Code for that is 20 now. This is the big one, boys. The Torque Nootropic Stack is 35% off. Code for that is 35 Torque. You can find the code and the link in the description of this video. Cortex Stack, focus and flow in a bottle with potent instant stimulation. This thing is 25% off. Code for that is 25 Cortex. And lastly, I am a consultant on TRT, nootropic regimen formulation, energy optimization, sexual dysfunction, libido optimization, host of other things. You can hire me in under minutes at livecortex.com. So I'm having to be on the left-hand side here just because of the format of the presentation that I'm about to give you guys. But first, let's talk about 9-methylbeta-carbolene. 9-MeBC is a research chemical that has been studied for alleviation of Parkinson's symptoms. It has a lot of dopamine-centered mechanisms. In this study here, it tells us that 9-MeBC stimulated the number of tyrosine hydroxylase immunoreactive neurons by increasing the protein and gene expression of tyrosine hydroxylase in pre-existing dopa decarboxylase immunoreactive neurons. Tyrosine hydroxylase is what your brain uses to take tyrosine and turn it into L-DOPA, which is one step before usable brain dopamine. Now, interestingly, there are additional benefits or general kind of brain-enhancing benefits of taking 9-methylbeta-carbolene, one of them being that it increases the expression of various nerve growth factors, somewhat akin to cerebrolysin. We've talked about that before. I'll flash the video on the screen if you want to go watch it. There's upregulation of not just brain-derived neurotrophic factor, but like glial cell-derived neurotrophic factor and some others with cerebrolysin. Well, guess what? 9-MeBC does that too. In this paper, they go, finally, 9-MeBC increased the expression of neurotrophic factors like glial cell-derived, line-derived neurotrophic factor and brain-derived neurotrophic factor in vivo studies, and also stimulated neurite outgrowth of dopaminergic neurons. So generally speaking, 9-MeBC is as close to, we think, or I think in the biohacking sphere thinks, a full systems dopamine regeneration compound that you can get your hands on. Well, specifically what I want to talk about in this video is a couple things. Predominantly, does it work as a temporary dopamine boost? And can this be effective for diagnosing a dopamine issue? So number one, does this work? Does 9-MeBC work? And by the way, that's just an image I found of 9-MeBC. I'm not promoting IntelliMeds. I'm not even sure if they have it. I've been getting it from Cameo. Does it work as a temporary dopamine boost? The answer to that question is probably yes. And the reason I say probably, having experience with it and definitely noticing when I run a cycle on 9-MeBC, on day one, I am more motivated and way more energized. My brain just wants to do stuff. I'm so interested in life when dopamine is firing at adequate quantities. But in this paper, when they talk about the monoamine oxidase A and monoamine oxidase B inhibition, which effectively inhibiting those chemicals allows more neurotransmitters to stay around in the brain, they go, the inhibition of monoamine oxidase by 9-MeBC might contribute to the observed increased dopamine content and anti-apoptotic properties in cell culture after 9-MeBC treatment in recent studies. So what they're effectively saying is, yeah, though it does enhance dopamine in all these different regions of your brain, it enhances dopamine synthesis via enhancing the conversion enzymes for dopamine. It also may be elevating acutely dopamine via inhibiting effectively the breakdown of dopamine. When you inhibit monoamine oxidase, you slow the breakdown of the monoamine neurotransmitters, and one of which is dopamine. So you keep it around longer. So the question of does it work as a temporary dopamine boost is, again, probably yes. Like, again, you may have elevation of other neurotransmitters, you may have an elevation of serotonin, but almost definitely via both the dopaminergic genetic activity upregulation that 9-MeO-BC is able to induce, and proven so in studies, as well as the inhibition of monoamine oxidase there, where you've got a temporary acute state of elevated dopamine. So while I don't really suggest using 9-MeO-BC as an acute like nootropic, like that's not how I use it, or that's not how I would suggest you use it, it may be useful for identifying if you have a dopamine problem or for creating a temporary boost of dopamine. Again, you generally want to run cycles of it, so just keep that in mind. If you're into experimenting, yeah, take a 20 milligram or 30 milligram dose of 9-MeO-BC orally. Do not dose it sublingually, despite what Reddit tells you to do. And you're probably going to find within an hour or so after administration that you feel a lot more energized, motivated, focused, and dopaminergic. Now, but importantly, in this context of using it sort of as a one-off, number 2 is really relevant here. Can it be effective for diagnosing dopamine issues? I mean, look, if you are anhedonic and you don't feel pleasure for things, if you are on TRT and estrogen's in range and everything looks cool, but you have no libido and you've got a poor erectile response, if generally your zest for life has gone out the window, if you're kind of depressed and you are not excited about anything, despite things in your life maybe even going well, then maybe dopamine is the issue. Maybe. Because there's a lot of things that, kind of mimic dopamine signaling deficiencies. And 9-MeO-BC can be, almost definitely will be, very effective for diagnosing said issues. Case in point, like if you take a 20 milligram or 30 milligram dose of 9-MeO-BC and suddenly you have some alleviation of the anhedonia that you've been feeling, and suddenly your emotions are back and you're starting to feel kind of excited about life, and like starting to connect back to your old self that did exist at some point that your brain does remember. Or again, you have an alleviation from your libido problems. Like libido is very, very complex. I mean, I couldn't list everything that contributes to libido in one sentence or one video, but I mean, suffice to say, the limbic system in the brain, which is predominantly driven as it relates to libido by dopamine, is one of the major parts. Now, testosterone and estradiol and prolactin, all these things influence libido. Testosterone predominantly by increasing tyrosine hydroxylase and thus dopamine output, estradiol by inhibiting arcuate nucleus borne dopamine. But dopamine, like if you have a dopamine problem and like just a real significant dopamine firing issue or a lack of TIDA neurons, these are the neurons that are in the hypothalamus, I believe, that signal through the infundibulum to the pituitary to block prolactin. If you've got an issue in that part of the dopaminergic system, your libido is going to be pretty crappy. PT141, by the way, will likely help because it's optimizing dopamine in that area. But anyway, if you've got alleviation of your libido from taking 9-MeO-BC, well, that's a pretty good indicator that you need to systemically or strategically work on dopamine. So this is where 9-MeO-BC can be useful in diagnosing certain dopaminergic issues. In the past, I've suggested cabergoline for this because this is a dopamine D2 receptor agonist, which is very powerful and sits at the receptor for about 80 hours. And while I still think that's the case, that's also a prescription drug and harder to get. And 9-MeO-BC is a research chemical that is easier to get. So yes, it can be extremely effective for diagnosing dopamine issues. If you take it and you get alleviation from what you think are dopaminergic issues, then you know that is the system to target. And maybe you target it with 9-MeO-BC on a 20 to 40 milligram a day cycle for 30 or 40 days with the weekends off optionally. You can either run it 7 days a week or take the weekends off. It's entirely up to you. I like to, for good measure, take weekends off when I'm running cycles of this. And then hopefully, that'll give you some good alleviation of your dopaminergic issues. Again, you are upregulating a bunch of neurotrophic factors, the genetic basis for dopamine projection and action in the brain, possibly dopamine receptors, possibly. There is no known mechanism for this. You kind of have to just look at what it's doing and postulate that it might upregulate dopamine receptors, and you'll get alleviation of your symptoms in most cases if dopamine is the issue. Number 3, though, okay, so those are the major takeaways, the key takeaways that I want to get across. It does work as a temporary dopamine boost, and it can be effective in that same context for diagnosing dopamine issues. But can have side effects. Okay, 9-MeBC is not without its spectrum of side effects in the plethora of anecdotals out there on the web. These side effects aren't really reported in the scientific literature, but they are reported among people that take 9-MeBC, and the most predominant one is sun sensitivity. Through some sort of action in potentially DNA, but obviously your skin, it is effectively upregulating your reaction to the sun. So you might find that, you might find it to be the case, and this is reported across the many anecdotals. It's never really happened to me, but I'm not saying it can't happen to you, that when you're out in the sun, you may you may actually feel sunburn when you're just exposed to the sun, when not for sitting in the sun for 4 hours, in Daytona Beach, Florida, but like just being exposed to the sun, your skin might actually burn a little bit. Again, I can't really explain the mechanism for this. I haven't looked into it all that detailed, but it does exist, and I would say that's a caveat. You should absolutely watch out for that if that happens. Now, if you think that the trade-off or the risk is worth it, then go for it, because in some cases people are extremely desperate from either methylphenidate abuse, Adderall abuse, other dopaminergic drugs abuse, recreational drug abuse, etc., that has either desensitized the response to dopamine at some level via the receptors, or has inhibited firing of dopamine, from their various origination points in the brain. So you got to kind of weigh that out. As far as the anecdotals go relating to sun sensitivity and excessive sunburn-like burning in the presence of sun while you're acutely dosing 9-MeBC, that effect tends to go away as people cycle off of the compound. But it seems as if it is prevalent for those susceptible to this for the duration of the cycle of 9-MeBC. So keep that in mind. We need to regenerate dopamine, fine, but you might have some side effects. Again, keep in mind when using 9-MeBC that it's elevating monoamine neurotransmitters as well. Like it's not just focusing on dopamine. It is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor to some extent, which again is going to keep neurotransmitters around longer because you're preventing the breakdown of neurotransmitters. So it's hard to distinguish the dopaminergic effects or the powerful brain energy effects of 9-MeBC thinking it's dopamine from what ultimately is just an elevation of catecholamines, serotonin, probably maybe acetylcholine, who knows, right? So just keep that in mind when you're dosing it. The studies are very clear on all of the dopaminergic mechanisms, and if you want a paper on that, I don't think that is it there. It's this paper here. Okay, 9-methyl-beta-carboline inhibits monoamine oxidase activity and stimulates expression of neurotrophic factors by astrocytes. You want to read every bit of the dopaminergic mechanisms for this to validate that it is predominantly a dopamine-centered compound. Please go read this paper. I will link in the description of this video. Let's talk about cycling because this is important. I really think that you definitely have to run cycles of it, especially if there are side effects like sun sensitivity, where you can actually have acute skin burning, not to the point where you could physically see burning or anything. I mean, it's not that crazy, but you may feel a sensation that your skin is like sunburnt from using 9-MeBC. You should cycle off of it. Again, generally speaking, 20 to 50 milligrams, 30 to 40 or 50 days straight. I'd cap it at 50. Preferably take off on the weekends. Take 2 to 3 weeks or maybe even a month thereafter to gauge how it's affected you. Usually, and the studies suggest, more than 10 days of usage is where you're going to get somewhat permanent effects. So 2 or 3 days of usage is only good for diagnosing dopamine issues or like getting some sort of acute, neurotransmitter boost, which it almost definitely will do. But you want to take it for long periods of time, then cycle off. Okay. And I guess that would be a great transition into the last major key takeaway here, which is there's just a lack of consistent studies. Yeah. I mean, there are big, long, exhaustive papers on 9-MeBC. There are, but after those papers were published, not a whole lot happened. I mean, there's a good degree of papers, right? And they explain all this positive dopaminergic enhancement element of 9-MeBC, but then it's like the studies stopped. You can't really find any additional papers. And I'm not sure if, this is anecdotal, but somebody had mentioned, the 9-MeBC itself and the studies lacked funding because they lost funding, and whatever decision was made for future funding not to be available, like we have no idea. Like this is just not stuff we're privy to, so this is a reason to be careful and to tread lightly when dosing 9-MeBC. That's also a reason you should cycle off. We have no papers on people taking 9-ABPC for 100 days straight. We have no idea. Like, again, it didn't really progress into further becoming a drug. Maybe it is still progressing. We really have no idea for people with Parkinson's. So like, we have no data on human beings taking it for very long periods of time. So if you're experimenting and you're a biohacker and you're an enthusiast about this stuff and you think you have dopaminergic issues, okay, go for it. But just understand the risks, and particularly there's a lack of good consistent studies. There are good ones, but there are no more in addition to those good ones. But yeah, again, the primary point I want to make is, two very effective ways to use it would be to induce a temporary dopamine boost. Okay, you can take 9-ABPC that way, but like, again, in that context, really the beneficial reason to be doing that is to diagnose a dopamine issue. If you take 9-ABPC and you have like alleviation of your anhedonia, your libido, your sexual issues, in some cases erectile issues, your general motivation and zest for life, your focus, if you've taken a lot of Adderall, you've taken some other dopamine stimulant drugs and they have affected post using them how your brain functions, and you think it's related to dopamine, and this would be a very, very effective compound for diagnosing dopamine issues. You get alleviation of those things, you recognize dopamine is the issue. You've got to work on it either with 9-ABPC or some other chemicals, maybe cerebral lysin, maybe 9-ABPC plus bromontane. It's really up to you. And I've provided a good degree of information on this channel and at livecortex.com in video courses for you to be able to distinguish between, or discern what you should do. If you don't want to quite go into the land of the realm of research chemicals, I built a nootropic stack that is heavily dopaminergic. It's got some pretty powerful dopamine release and dopamine building agents in it, in addition to some other compounds. It's called Torque, and that is 35% off right now. Code for that is 35Torque. Cortex stack, dopaminergic as well, but also stimulant inducing. Very, very powerful. Onsets really quickly. 25% off right now. Code for that is 25 Cortex. Again, if you need to hire me, this is busy season, so I am pretty busy, but there are still slots open for TRT protocol optimization. It's one of the primary things that I do and get a lot of consults for: nootropic regimen formulation, dopamine issues, sexual dysfunction, lots of other specialties. You can hire me in under a minute at livecortex.com. And again, if you go to the courses tab at livecortex.com and find the supercharged dopamine course, this will break down the use of 9-ABPC in that course. Okay, so I've broken down cycles in it, as well as a lot of other dopamine hacking protocols to restore dopamine. All right, it's been a pleasure hanging out with you guys. Please like the video if you liked it, or you can dislike it if you disliked it. Totally fine. Thanks though, buddy. Sub to the channel because you are going to love the detailed scientific breakdowns and the topics that we cover on this channel relevant to biohacking, TRT, neurooptimization, nootropics, and a lot of other topics. It's been a pleasure being with you. I hope you're having a great day. I hope you're having a great week. Thanks for watching, and I will talk to you guys on the next one.